like we just said, it's continuing on from our previous session, which they sort of go hand in hand. Bruno and I were just talking about the Ibunka survey, which is the way we're putting all, getting these ideas together and sort of making a database of information, which we know we want to use somehow in a classroom, but we're still working on the ways in which we're going to do that. So we've been doing this for about, how long now? Almost a year.
Almost a year, yeah.
Almost a year we've been doing this, but I've only started putting these ideas into the classroom, well, since I went back into the classroom, so from October. So I've been working on using these activities in the context is I teach at a private women's university here in Kyoto, and it's a very small group of non-English majors who I've been given free rein to teach, just teach a basic English, it has to be Senmon Eigo. So I thought, okay, we can do an English class about intercultural communication, and they should lap it up. But it didn't, as you'll find out, there were a few hiccups. There still are hiccups. There's still a long way to go. But we are getting to a point now where we can sort of see how these topics and the idea for a textbook and for materials does have a certain, it has a lot of potential, and we really do want to work it through and make something really special out of it. So this group, about half of them have overseas experience, but this is not any long-term, in-depth experience. A lot of them just traveled abroad for travel, but also some of them have been for study abroad. So that comes into play a little bit when we're talking about comparing with other cultures. But most of the time, a lot of the class is, as you'll see, getting to reflect on their own culture. So I'll just go back. Sorry, back to the start. Okay, it's a bit slower up on there. So, okay, our mission, to frame it in sort of kakkoi words, it's to increase our student awareness of basic intercultural concepts. Now, I've used the word concept here, but as we've pointed out, we don't want to start with concepts. We maybe, at the end of the class or at the end of the course, have them with some idea of different cultural systems and how they compare to their own, and how those differences are going to affect them when in the future when they travel abroad or when they have any kind of intercultural experience. So, but while doing that, we also want to have them recognize the diversity and complexity of cultural habits. Now, this is the big thing that shocked me when I started teaching intercultural communication as a topic. And even today, I'll hear students say, "Oh, foreigners do this and Japanese do this," and so it's a very extreme way of framing it. But there is a tendency, and I think most people will agree, that it's sort of Japanese people Japanese culture is compared to other cultures as a one-to-one thing, and we want them to look at, as Bruno was saying, the differences between, say, French culture and American culture, for example, are quite many and complex and interesting. And so just having them understand that, not all Western cultures are the same. And even within Japanese culture, there's differences. Even though, as Mark was saying, classmates do tend to want to go towards some agreement, and we're all the same. We all have the same basic values and ideas and habits. In fact, there are differences. And even if there are not differences within the classroom, there are differences within Japanese culture. So we wanted them to think about that before we even start looking at interculture or cultural habits from other cultures. Just as a point, we're using the word culture here in a very basically. Of course, we understand that people use the word culture to talk about many different things, and one of the criticisms of, or one of the reasons that maybe intercultural communication is kind of hampered is because, culture can be anything. Culture can be, from a different university can have a different culture to another university, or individuals have separate culture. Like there's a otaku culture, and hobbies or cultures and all of this. So you can slice and dice the word many different ways, but we are using it in our survey, in our textbook, in our materials, to mean basically culture as a country. So when you go abroad, when you go to a different nationality, so.
Right. It's paradoxical because within a given country there are many subcultures indeed, areas and between genders and family cultures and many types of cultures indeed. But it's also true that you have to cut the line somewhere, and then it is also possible to say that as a whole there are certain characteristics that apply to Americans or French people or Japanese people. So we need to keep both perspectives at the same time. Yeah.
So teach. We're going these materials that we're working on. The goal is to teach students to use English, their target language, to explore and discuss these themes. Most of the textbooks that I've been using over the years were, you would read 3 or 4 pages of text about identity, and then there would be a few questions about, reading comprehension questions. So students could get through, it was a slog, they could get through it, but they didn't really have much understanding of these topics, like how it related to their own lives, or, what identity really was, because a lot of the questions and a lot of the way that the textbooks were written it was just purely a language thing. It was like finding the correct answer out of a bank of text. So
and complicated also.
Very, very complicated. Yeah. So we want to make it simple. So deductive. When we say deductive versus inductive, we just wanted to talk about, as we said in the first workshop, we want to go from the everyday to the more general concepts of culture, rather than most other books going from very, very basic, very, very arcane concepts, and then finding specific examples from that. So we thought about the progression of each topic or each lesson to start from the personal. So what do you do every day? What are your habits? How many hours do you sleep? Do you think it's enough? And then from that, they interview or they interact with their classmates, and they compare with people around them. And then they look at Japanese culture, and rather than saying we Japanese all do this, we'd like them to look at the differences within Japanese culture, and just to note that there is a little bit of diversity within Japan. And then from there we go to the other cultures and see how some of these quite deep and key differences play out. So like I said, this is the context that I've been working on the material. So we'll get straight into, these are some snippets of some of the stuff that we've drawn up. This is all done up quite nicely, but there are PDFs. We have some lessons ready just about to we can share with people if they're interested in testing this kind of material, but this is how it is at this stage. So we start off with a survey for individual students, and they sit and they will be just reading through 4 or 5 questions which to set the scene, to give them the topic. So this one is about in the classroom behavior, classroom habits. And the end point that you want to get to in this lesson is the way in which students interact with the teacher, or when you're asked a question by the teacher in class. Basically, do you answer or do you sit in silence? And if you do that, if you are silent and you don't answer, and you don't interact with your teacher, if you do study abroad one day, this will have, it'll have negative effects, and you won't be seen in the same way as other students. So this has a very practical bent, but it's also something that's very, it's something that any student can answer. They all have an answer to this because it's what they do every day. So they go through this as quickly as possible. Now, when I say scaffolded with vocab translations, we have obviously the students that I'm using this with right now, they cannot read this and understand it all without looking up some of the terminology, some of the vocab is a bit beyond their level. So we have Japanese translations at hand for them. Whether or not you use Japanese in your class, given that this is an English language class, again, this is personal preferences, and there are different schools of thought on this. But for my classes, if it keeps the class moving and it keeps understanding to a level where the class will progress at a decent pace, then I'm all for using Japanese translations for them to grasp these concepts. Because when all is said and done, if they don't grasp the concept, they're not going to get past this first page. So we do have translations, but this is basically designed to be done, within 5 minutes. Like, quickly, I run through this with the whole class, make sure everyone knows, what everything means, and then they fill in their own answers. So question 5, the final question of the survey is open-ended. This requires them to write an answer rather than just tick a box. So why do you think a student would remain silent after being asked a question directly by the teacher in front of the class? Well, this is a very specific sort of situation, but most of them can imagine this. They've been in this situation. So we give them a couple of model sentences. For example, I think that some students hesitate their answer because they're not confident. And we have a vocabulary, we have a toolbox of different phrases and vocab which they can plug in there, and write a couple of sentences to express their own opinion. Now from there, here's an example of one that's been filled out.
Yeah, with your ink on, yeah?
Yes. I don't know if the ink on is a big point, but it's just, I go around the class and I don't check the answers to questions 1 through 4, but I will look at 5, and because, students will complete this at different, some of them will do it quite quickly, some of them spend a bit more time on their answer. So I'll go around and just, have a chat with them, have them read it out, correct some, basic grammar points, and then just give them a little stamp. And then the first section is done rather quickly. But by that point, they know what we're talking about, basically. They know, and they've given their own responses to these questions. And then, is the screen still being shared, I wonder? Hope so.
Okay,
Oh. You are the co-host now. Can you see this? Can everyone still see the slides? Or they're gone? Where did they go?
Yeah, I can't see them. Oh, now they're coming back.
Okay, good. Terrific.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, now it's okay.
terrific. Thank you. Sorry about that. So now, based on the survey, with the class until this point has been, rather silent. Well, there's no interaction between students yet, so we want them to start talking to each other. We'll have them ask these questions, the same 5 questions from the survey, to each other. So they go around and they'll find a partner and ask the questions and take down the answer in note form. So we found this works extremely well because it's very clear, it's very direct. And it's something that they've just been working on so they can say their answer. They know their answer. There's no wrong or right answers here. And it's just, there's a little bit of interest as well, and they're finding out, are we all the same in the end? And, there's enough difference, there's enough variation even within this very small class to make it, oh, really, you only sleep 6 hours a night, that's a lot, And it is possible to take this in any number of directions. You can drill some responses to each other, but I think the big discovery with this was when we go from written language to spoken language. When we first wrote the draft of this, the surveys are, which of the following do you believe is da, 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 da. And when students read that out to each other, obviously it doesn't sound right, because the difference between, you know, what is on the page and what you're saying to somebody is, you know, there's the context is completely different. So we realized we had to recant the questions, right? There's spoken questions, and even that in itself is an interesting exercise to show the students the difference between spoken and written language. And something I've just started, I've done this kind of exercise in class about maybe 4 or 5 times now. I've done 4 or 5, maybe 5 topics. And until now, I've only had students, you know, interview each other, but I've realized that they can interview me as well. Like, obviously, I'm not Japanese, but let's just say I'm Japanese for interest's sake, or so I can have one student, you know, ask me a question in front of them, and they can all be taking down my answer in note form. And that's a good way to get everyone on the same page as well.
Right. Yeah, there are many formats this activity can be used. But basically, get students talking to each other is the thing. Yeah.
And it's not intercultural communication yet, but it is communication about cultural habits at this point. So this is we found that if we don't do groundwork like this, I mean, it's suddenly just dropping information on them about, you know, French and, you know, this is what it's like in Australia. They've got nothing to anchor it, nothing to compare it with. So it may seem like, well, this is just a normal conversation class, but it's all leading up to our next point, or the next part, which is this is our students actually doing the interview. So you know, it's a very small class, but there's enough interest there. You know, the fact that they have to take notes and fill in these little, the fact that there's empty space for them to fill in is, you know, another psychological.
It's reassuring for
Right.
Japanese students. Yeah.
So then we want to look a little bit more look at the diversity within Japan, and we have them write some expressions, or write 3 sentences about groups of people within your culture. Now, the easiest way to do this is to compare 2 groups. So we have a list of different groups of people, different people from different areas of Japanese society in the green box on the left, and then we have a list of verbs, tendencies, habits in the purple on the right. And to start with, they just plug and play. But because all of the grammar is there for them, they have to think about whether it makes sense. They have to think about the content, and this is again making them sort of engage with the topic a little bit more, on a slightly deeper level than just talking about themselves.
And as you said before, it helps them also to take habits of expressing themselves in a bit more refined way, rather than saying Japanese people do this and Japanese people do that. Don't do that. But more like people tend to, some majority of people, etc., etc.
That's something that I really want to push in this material. Is I want my students to be able to speak in a nuanced way, and it's something I did the last couple of weeks much more intensively. Because if you just say, Japanese people do this, and Americans do that, it sounds. You sound very, very, it's just too narrow-minded. So to say things like, in my opinion, construction workers are more likely than, office workers to get a good night's sleep, or something like that. It's a little bit more, using terms like more likely, or, most of, so just little points that are not too grammatically difficult, but they can have a huge effect on how nuanced someone sounds. We want to push that as well. So this is a very simple. In most Japanese classrooms, boys ask questions more than girls. Okay, so that's it's very grammatically simple, but it's kind of culturally interesting. Oh, really? This is we're teaching this at an all-girls university. So I think we were surprised that a lot of the differences, a lot of the topics that they wanted to talk about were differences between boys and girls.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was in that class, and I did the interview, same as if I was a student. And this is something we didn't think about before, but it seems that in all girls schools, it's easier for students to speak out than in co-ed schools. I had never thought about that before, but seems to be the case.
So that showed us as well that some things that we assume are going to be interesting for the students are not always the case. Like we'll try something in class and we get some interesting answers. And that's actually what they want to talk about. So keeps us on our toes. So then after the expression, we go to people in other cultures. So the class is really split into two. The first one is you and your culture. Part two is people in other cultures. This is where we start looking at intercultural communication, as it's traditionally called. So this is where we use little snippets of information, little stories and responses from the survey that we were talking about in the workshop just now. So I think this is the same one we showed before, but it's the question is, in the culture you grew up in, would you say that it's considered important to manage your sleep? And then we have two responses to that. To get the students to read this and to make sense of it and to try and put it into their cultural knowledge or their cultural understanding, we've got a few different reading comprehension exercises. We find the easiest one is the true or false, because it's just looking for content. And
it's just helping students to go through these texts. It's not so long actually, it's just a few, each response is a few sentences long, but to students it looked like on one page there is maybe four or five responses like this.
Yeah, it's a lot of text actually.
And to students it can look very actually like a lot of text.
Intimidating.
So it was how to break it down.
Yeah. But also putting pictures and speaking bubbles and things like that. I mean, the way, even the layout has a huge effect on how the students, if it's a page of full text, they tend to shy away from it and not engage with it. But if it's a little bit more lively, then this is the best way we've found so far. If anyone else has any tricks or tips about how to having students engage with a long section of text in an English class is something I haven't done a lot of because of obviously I teach mostly speaking and communication, but it is something we need to deal with.
Yeah, I don't know if you have planned this for your next slide, but the big thing also we've found out was that asking them to rank their interest among several responses that was in the next slide.
That's in the next one.
Sorry.
That's the big discovery.
Sorry.
No. It's, so then obviously reading comprehension is good, and then we can, if the classes are warmed up enough and at a good level, we can have some sort of little discussion about that. But I like to finish the class with them doing something active. I don't want them to just be reading and then the bell goes and we're finished, and then next week we're talking about shopping or whatever. I wanted to actually produce something towards the end. So we're working on, we have 3 different ways of doing this now. We only originally started with number 1, which was, as Bruno just said, choose the response that interested you most and explain why. And this, I was a little bit skeptical about this at first because I thought, okay, it's writing. They have to write, 3 or 4 sentences in response to something. And are they really going to be interested in this? But they actually did quite a good job. I was surprised that they came up with they found something that was very, very different to their own cultural habits, or something that was quite similar, and they would comment on that. So we did get some good responses.
Yeah.
But the key is, the key is that you choose one out of the 6,
Yeah.
and or ranking them. What's your number 1, 2, 3? So, yeah, sorry.
No.
That was it. The key is all that ranking. Which one do you like best? I think it's a psychological trick. I think if you ask someone, if you're standing in front of the station, you're handing out your booklet about something. You say, "Would you like a booklet?" No one will take it. But if you have 2, one is green and one is pink, you say, "Which one would you like?" You have to choose one. People tend to take one in that situation more than
Absolutely.
So it's like, rather than "Would you like to reply to this?" It's "Which one would you like to reply to?" It's a subtle thing, but it has a huge effect. The second one, which I started doing a couple of weeks ago, was something I did in conversation classes from years and years ago, but it just suddenly hit me that it worked well in certain topics. For example, asking a favor, which is as we said, it's a communication style topic. So I just give them a blank piece of paper and say, "Right, draw a manga." It doesn't have to be, Studio Ghibli level. It just be, stick figures, but show some sort of interaction between 2 people. So this could be a nice surprise. It could be a misunderstanding. It could be a shock, but just something about 2 people with, 2 different cultural systems coming into contact. I have an example of that coming up as well. Sorry, this kind of thing. These are not, here we go. Here's the manga. So it's just, I tell them, obviously, we're not going to grade you on how well you draw pictures, but we just want to, to see that some sort of interaction is taking place. And the good thing about this is, rather than in written language, rather than in a written response, they can show some context, they can show some emotion. A lot of our students have grown up reading manga, so they are very, very, they understand the way of reading and writing them very well. They're very, literate with manga. So even if it's not a great picture, they understand the language of manga, and it works very well in that sense.
And it's just fun for them.
It's fun to draw, and and then. But if you can show me that you understand some sort of, cultural system or some, doesn't have to be the clash of cultures. We did have a tendency at the start to want to talk about the clash of cultures, but in fact, it's not always like that. It's just maybe misunderstandings or pleasant surprises or those things as well.
And I've seen a few of those mangas your students made, and sometimes they just don't understand very well, actually.
Don't get it.
But what's interesting is they started thinking in that way, in that direction.
Yeah.
They started thinking about this as a cultural issue, and then something might happen, and that's already something.
Yeah. So sorry, number 1. Yeah, we'll go back to number 1. This is how we set up the written expression. So, which one of the 7 responses on these pages is most interesting to you? Justify your choice using the model expressions. So, just using things like, "I find it surprising that," "It seems to me that," "From my point of view." So it's structured. I found Melanie's response to be the most interesting. They fill in the name of the person whose response most rang a bell with them, and then they write. They say why.
They say why.
There's a few sentences about that.
I was surprised about how rich their responses to this question were.
Yeah.
Because students are really not that high level, not at all. But so I was expecting, like quite plain. It's interesting because I was surprised, these kind of very plain sentences. But they made an effort to explain why, and in the process they talked a little bit about their own habits. Right.
I think if they're engaged with the topic by this point, they will want to say something about it, because they will want to compare themselves with one of the responses in the last couple of pages, or one of the, maybe I feel a similar to Melanie because and they'll give us a reason. So yeah. So we've got type 1 is the written expression, type 2 is the manga, and type 3 is something we just started recently, which was practical skills. So things that actually, as people were pointing out to us in the previous workshop, give them some skills that they can use when they go abroad, or this kind of thing. And this we haven't really got it into a proper format yet. But for example, this was the board the other day for when I did in the classroom. So why is Kentaro, the student, remaining silent when the teacher has said, Kentaro, deal with your parents? So, there are many reasons why he's silent. He can't hear what was said, he didn't understand the question, doesn't know the answer, doesn't know how to answer, he's not sure, he doesn't want to answer because it's too personal, and then he needs some kind of thing. And these are all just conversation strategies, really. So we want to use this as sort of an endpoint for the lesson, because they've seen that in these different cultural systems of the classroom in Japan, it's much more okay to be silent when the teacher has asked you a question directly, but in other cultures it's not so okay. So how do you answer, or how do you respond to the teacher within, in a culturally appropriate way? And these play out in these practical skills. So.
And we are thinking about making audio tracks for those, and after introducing these little strategies which correspond each to one case in which you are stuck, the teacher could play the audio track and say, okay, just listen to this situation, and in this case, what would you say? How would you reply? Which strategy would you use? Then students have to actively try to apply this. And I was surprised you said that one of your students said it was fun.
Yeah.
She stayed after class.
Yeah.
She stayed after class to tell her teacher.
Lovely.
Yeah. Wow.
So yeah, this was the other day I did the topic about in the classroom, and Japanese students have a tendency to be silent in class, that there's a very different there's a classroom dynamic is generally quite different to other cultures, but we wanted to show them that when a teacher asks you a question, if you're in a Western, your teacher's from a Western culture, and they ask you a question, you don't answer within a few seconds, then that teacher will be feeling some kind of, there's some sort of cultural gap there. And we don't want to say, good or bad, or, this is the gold standard, but we just want to show them, point them in the direction of some skills which can maybe bridge these cultural gaps in some way. This is the first version, this is the first one we've done with this, but there are a few other topics that perhaps lend themselves to practical skills, like how do you guide a conversation?
Yeah.
How do you take part actively in a conversation? There are certain, conversation skills, or dialogue, skills that you can use.
Yeah, these kind of activities will probably lend themselves more to the communication styles lessons, like asking a favor, or apologizing, or making excuses, or this kind of thing. Presenting oneself, introducing oneself. Also, we're thinking about one of these.
Yeah. So that's all I had. The last one. Thank you for listening. That's basically where we're at this point in time. And for the last little bit, anyone was welcome to questions, comments, ideas, because as we keep saying, we're still at the still on the drawing board for many of these. We've actually come back to the drawing board on a lot of these topics. We've done a few things where, as we were saying, the clash of cultures, or the meeting of cultures. One of our first attempts at making an exercise for that was having two people from different cultures. For example, a Japanese wife and an American husband. And the husband wants to bring people over to his house after work and have some beers with them, just like we did back home. But the Japanese wife resists that idea. And there's a little bit of a back and forth, and they both explain their situation, but they still don't understand each other. And what are these two people thinking? So we had these empty thought bubbles coming out of their heads.
Yeah.
And we had the students, we said, right, you guys have understood this topic completely now, go into their heads and write down what they're thinking. And found that they couldn't do it. I mean, we'd hoped that they would have, that their intercultural competence would have got them to the point where they can imagine what someone was thinking, but they couldn't do it. Which obviously, looking back now, it's absolutely,
so obvious.
it's so obvious that you cannot ever know what someone else is thinking.
You cannot imagine, try to go and imagine what someone might be thinking in that situation because of their different culture. It's just too difficult the thought process.
It was a bridge too far, I think. But it showed us, it was good in that it showed us, hey, that's something that, if you have very, very high level students and you get to the point where now we want to look at, more deep culture, then maybe one day we could do something like that. But at this level and at with the way that we're doing it, the standard, the progression we're doing it at, it's just a little bit too much. So we want to have more activities which are more grounded and immediate for them.
Hey, I had some thoughts, if you don't mind. So, Stephen, like for CIC3, the latest version of Conversations in Class, when we did the listening, we recorded all the listening exercises with 3 different accents.
Right.
And of all the feedback I've gotten on that book, almost a lot of it is about people love that. They love hearing different accents and different kinds of English, right? Because there's not only one type of English, right? And anyway, so my point is, if you could get people with different accents, like to actually record those snippets, then perhaps you could introduce, that would be an alternative way to deal with the text, right? Because you asked before about how ideas for dealing with the text, right? So perhaps they could listen to it first, listen for something, and then do a multiple choice, and then dive into the actual words itself. I don't know, that's just a thought. But anyway, more listening, like to hear the people talking would bring the whole thing to life. If you had, I know that's, you got to collect people, and that would be hard and all that, but it would be really amazing if you could do it.
Absolutely. We discovered that along the way. We realized that was an absolute, audio is a key. It's another way to deliver the content to them.
Yeah, exactly.
In another way, it breaks up the monotony of looking at the text.
That's right.
So we will do that as much as we can.
Great.
If it's okay.
Yes.
He was saying about the audio and the accents. I think that's a great thing. A lot of the kids, especially when they're going abroad, they want to hear the variety to get prepared. I know my students, they learn the New Zealand accent, and the sooner they can hear and get used to it, the more confident they are in it. Going back to a moment ago about trying to fill in the bubbles of what the other person is thinking in the culture. We did a similar kind of activity along those lines, but what we did instead was presented it in a drama, a very short skit.
Right, like role play or something, yeah.
In a role play, and it was the teacher and me that demonstrated it. And then we said, well, one's the Japanese student, one is the shopkeeper. Now, why do you think the shopkeeper was upset here? Why did they feel strange? Why do you think the Japanese student felt awkward in this situation? What do you think happened here? And then we could address, well, in foreign countries, usually the shopkeeper is very friendly and they talk to people, they want to know you. Whereas in Japan, it's very distant, you're separate. And so we reversed it. We showed the reverse. In my situation in Japan, when someone says "irashaimase," I go, "Oh, well, good morning," and there's a new cultural reaction, like, "Oh, why is this foreigner talking to me?" kind of reaction. So we showed it from both sides as well, and this is just referring to Japan and U.S. New Zealand culture, but it gave it students to see the actual like situation. So I think even if you could do a little video or role play or something that they could, okay, here's the situation. What would you do? Like you were saying before about, how would you, you would give them a skill or a conversation strategy. I think actually role playing it out even more or showing role plays so they can see what's actually happening might help too.
That's a great idea. I was going to suggest it. You beat me to it. Great.
People to do it well. On video, after everything needs to be okay and not offensive. Also, it's easy to be offensive or to be taken as offensive. We got a comment, for example, when we were trying on this on these 2 pages that we deleted now. Someone said, "Oh, but in both cases, the Japanese persons looks a bit stupid." And it's like, oh, wow, we were not going for that really, but it was easy for the people to think, that we are looking down on the Japanese side of the interaction. That's tricky, and we are a bit anxious about that, I must say.
I think the key to that is you have to have, especially with the survey, you can just actual experiences. The ones that we presented with the shopkeeper, that was my experience. That was the Japanese teacher's experience abroad. And so we could say, hey, this is what had happened to us. You may have, or you may not have a same situation. So it wasn't, at that case, we weren't looking down. I could see if you were standing outside of the situation, you might have problems.
Yeah, I think once you put a name on it and once you personalize these stories and say somebody said this is what someone did, this is what someone felt, it takes so much pressure off and it makes it into this, it's an individual story. It's not just, we're not talking about a generalization about a certain group of people. And that was the thing that started everything, I think. Once we realized that, hey, let's make stories, let's write these stories and collect these stories about people's real experiences. That's been the biggest thing for me in that it's much easier to teach culture and intercultural communication now, rather than, because when you're starting from general concepts and one country versus another country, it's just too difficult and it's too dangerous, really. We don't want to go down that path. So
Bruno, really quick, you have a lot of experience, Bruno, with Hofstede and his scale, the dimensions of culture and all that. Is that kind of informing this project at all, or is there possibly some activities that you could get, like if you look at a high power distance and low power distance and that kind of thing? Is that possible somehow?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I mean some continuums that you can look at the end of the process are informed by indeed Hofstede's model. I mean, one of his dimensions is individualism,
collectivism, right?
Obviously, it's an important dimension of life, of culture. Yeah. The point is that we don't want to look at it to start with that one, and look at it in too broad a way, because it's. I had a problem with that dimension, because it's sometimes right, sometimes wrong. For example, just to take a quick example, a group of friends in France will not tolerate intimate behavior between couples. Like if 5 or 6 friends are eating out together, if there is a couple within these friends and they start, being too tender toward each other, they will say, "Go get a room." This is really not. And if I understand correctly, in America, it's much more okay to be like that. Like holding each other and sweet names and all always being on the same side, etc. So it can be said that in this way, French people are more collectivist and Americans are more individualistic. So it depends very much on the area of life. That's why it's interesting to look at specific areas of life and then go to these kind of concepts.
Okay, I was just curious.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question. Sorry, I'm Ewan. you mentioned a moment ago the idea of intercultural competence and wanting our students to gain that competence. Given that we're dealing with language and intercultural communication, would you say that competence is having the right target vocabulary in order to navigate those spaces when they're, when two cultures with perhaps conflicting, expectations or standards or values, knowing how to appropriately respond in those situations? And so is that competence, or is competence more of an effective thing where the student has imbibed some of the, the foreign cultures, kind of thought processes, the mentality, the way of thinking? What is competence in that respect?
I think there is a bit of both. One of the competencies can be to express one's reality. For example, to say, "Oh, I am surprised because personally, I'm more used to these kind of things," which is a big step in when you have a misunderstanding. Just express your reality is very big. So get used to expressing one's reality and one's cultural group reality in a nuanced way is already big, and that takes some linguistic skills. And the other side of it would be to the general approach when you are faced with a behavior which is strange. Usually the first impulse is to think that the person in front of you is stupid or is a bad person, a person with bad intentions. In that case, to think, oh, maybe that person is he belongs to a cultural world which is different from mine. And let's try to figure out in what kind of cultural system this behavior could make sense. It doesn't seem to make sense to me right now, but maybe if I talk a little bit, I'm going to start finding a way in which it makes sense. And we cannot go too far in that direction in the language class, obviously, but just having the first reflex to go in that direction would be a huge thing, I think. And that's something that is useful in many situations of life, not only when you go abroad, but also when you meet someone that doesn't respond in the way you're used to, even within your society.
Thank you.
So both. That would be my response.
Both, yeah. Competence is we want to. This is a language class textbook, but it also is intercultural communication. So again, that's something where we want to have a nice balance between the both. It's linguistic competence, but it's also this sort of stance that we want them to have when they think about other cultures as well.
And I think it's important to keep modest ambitions as well. Small steps are fine. Just learning to express oneself in a little bit more nuanced way is a huge progress. And just learning to think to react in a certain way when faced with a difficult situation, it's a huge step already. Don't need to get into super expert level expertise kind of ways. Well, yeah.
You raised though that this discussion raises the question of concepts again, and how far one wants to go in talking about what you present in number 3 as a practical skill, for example. Do you say, here's a form of words, here's things that Americans tend to say in situations like this. So you say, if you say this thing this way, this will suggest your competence. This will suggest that you're a nuanced thinker. This will suggest that you're culturally sensitive. Whereas if you say these words, you will look like an idiot, or you will sound stupid, or you will sound prejudiced, or something like that. And it touches the question that I find myself constantly coming up against. It is a sort of
phrase book approach to language teaching, in which you say, let's not talk about skills, let's not talk about competence, let's not talk about cultural sensitivity. Let's just say, these are words you can use. And you ought to have them in your vocabulary.
Yeah.
But just that last ought says, well, why ought I to have them? And then the question is, do I think that these show you to be a more nuanced, culturally sensitive person? But I can't say to my students, and so I'm always asking them, how do you say this in Japanese?
Yeah, me too. I did this.
Yeah, and I think that helps sometimes. Because the suggestion I sometimes seem to be making to them is, don't you have a more nuanced way to say this in your own? Don't you think about these things? I'm thinking about these things, and I think you ought to think about them. But I'm almost sure that they have a way to convey these feelings in Japanese. So I speaking of taking small steps, I find myself falling back and just saying, look, here's some words to say.
Yeah.
Memorize them or something.
Yeah.
But they're nothing more than that. I don't want to say they're anything more than that. But of course, I am saying that in some way.
Yeah.
I want to go further into the concept or the idea or the history of intercultural communication between, American anthropologists and Japanese professors, or Japanese government people, American government people. And then it just gets to be a mess. But to me, that's interesting, but it bores students to talk about that stuff.
Just give them give words.
Yeah.
Words are tools to touch reality and understand reality also.
Yeah, so those sentences that you wrote there in that last bit, and the student said, oh, that was interesting. Maybe it's interesting because, oh, these are things I can say. This is something I can do. And you don't have to go much beyond that. I don't know.
No, that's right. Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Any? No, I think we should wrap this up somehow.
Yeah.
Pizzas are coming.
Yeah, it's been a long day.
Yeah,
But thank you, everyone, for participating. I hope you got something out of our presentations.
Thanks, guys. It's got a.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.